I've been in the field of AI governance, I think, pretty much from the start. It is still rapidly evolving. It's not settled. How are we going to govern this new technology? How do we understand it to maximize the benefits and also to minimize the risks? I'll put this very directly. I mean, the phrase AI governance is actually ambiguous. And I think we need to make a decision. Are we going to govern AI, or are we going to be governed by AI? My name is Mark Rotenberg. I'm director and founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy in Washington, D.C. We are a global network of AI policy experts and human rights advocates. AI is today having an enormous impact on business and society around the world. It's a transformative technology, much like the internet or the personal computer. It's giving individuals and businesses and organizations new tools. They're very powerful. They're very impressive. Occasionally they make mistakes. And to me, one of the most interesting challenges is how are we going to govern this new technology? How do we understand it to maximize the benefits and also to minimize the risks? What AI governance is about is thinking how we allocate those responsibilities for safety and those rights to promote accountability in this rapidly evolving field. We're learning, for example, that large language models have great energy demands. So now AI and sustainability becomes an issue. We're learning that large language models can also produce, fantastic articles and music and artwork. But of course, that implicates copyright issues. So now we need to think about AI and its impact on copyright. And even issues of gender equity. When we look at the AI employment and we look at the training data that fuels AI models, we ask questions about who is being represented and who's participating. So from the early days, when it was largely about decision-making in the automated realm, today we look at far more issues that still come under the banner of AI governance. I think AI and employment is one of the very big issues facing American businesses today. And a lot of this comes down to how we make decisions about people. There was a company a few years ago, I won't mention their name, but they believed that they could assess whether someone was a good candidate for a job largely by their facial expressions or their hand gestures. And they said, you can conduct an online interview over Zoom. You don't even need to bring the person into your business or necessarily even read their resume, and we'll be able to tell you with some degree of accuracy whether or not they're a good fit for your company. And, a lot of companies were very intrigued by this because they were overwhelmed by the number of applicants, and this seemed scientific, which, sometimes is also a giveaway that maybe something is being hyped or oversold. But of course, when you started to look carefully, you realize that things like facial expressions and hand gestures are oftentimes varied by, culture and age and habit, don't necessarily reveal any truth about a person. This is the type of activity where I do think some regulation, is appropriate. So we need to find ways to promote transparency and accountability. As we become more dependent on AI-based systems for decision-making, if we don't have this ability to understand the basis of a decision, we're literally flying blind. So one of the great challenges we face as a nation today is ensuring that the public policies we develop for artificial intelligence do reflect important American values. Obviously, progress and innovation are important, but we are a country that believes in freedom, privacy, civil liberties, civil rights, And to ensure that these values are carried over into the AI era actually requires purposeful actions by government, because it's not at all clear that companies left alone will prioritize those values, or even the ones that choose to prioritize them will necessarily succeed. So we're looking both to the administration through the use of the president's executive authorities, to the Congress through legislation, and even to the federal agencies through the regulations that they issue to see that these values become embedded in the provision of AI services and the design of AI products. The leader in the field of digital regulation is often the European Union. Many people may be familiar with the EU GDPR. That's the famous data protection regulation. If you're participating in the European market and collecting the personal data on Europeans, it really doesn't matter whether you're based in Europe or you're based outside Europe. You're likely complying with the GDPR. The Artificial Intelligence Act of the EU, which was adopted earlier this year, is likely to play a similar role to the GDPR. And I will say, to the credit of the Europeans in the development of the AI Act, they spent almost 5 years seeking comments from the public, seeking comments from business, seeking comments from technical experts in the member states. The proposal went through a number of drafts. There was participation by the European Parliament, and finally a famous process known in EU circles as the trilogue, which is the dialogue that occurs between the 3 EU institutions to finalize the act. So we have today in the EU the most comprehensive AI regulation in the world, but it does represent a great deal of participation by a lot of people over several years. And I think that's a good process that should generally be encouraged. We're talking at a particular moment in time about the AI legislation in the United States Congress, and of course things will change over time. But I will say, having been in Washington for many years and having testified before many congressional committees, I'm really struck in this moment by the high degree of bipartisan cooperation on AI policy. And you see this particularly in the Senate. One of the ways we try to measure whether there's cooperation between the political parties is in the co-sponsorship of proposed legislation. Because if it's only one party or only the other party that's sponsoring the legislation, that's usually a giveaway that there's not really consensus. But in the AI realm, if the topic is, for example, misinformation in elections, or using generative AI to capture the value that would otherwise be provided by an artist or a musician, or to provide government investment in research, or to protect children against images that should not be online. All of these bills have high levels of bipartisan support and bipartisan co-sponsors. There's always, political rhetoric in politics, and it would not surprise me at all if President Trump will make a point of saying that he's going to do the opposite of whatever President Biden does. I mean, that does seem to be a big part of his operating style. But in practice, at least in this field, I will be surprised if they, for example, try to remove regulations that ensure safety with the AI systems that are being deployed by federal agencies. That's simply good government. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican. You want federal agencies to put in place those accountability mechanisms. And for those who are really interested in that field, it's worth noting that it was President Trump before President Biden who first proposed that the Office of Management and Budget put in place the regulations precisely for the purpose of AI safety. So I think it will be important that people don't get too caught up in the rhetoric. The rhetoric will be there, but we need to see what the actual actions are. We followed Elon Musk for a number of years in this field. He was one of the first people to call attention to concerns about the commercialization of OpenAI. When Musk put money in, he actually believed in having a non-commercial way to counterbalance the forces of the established tech firms, and he thought that was important. And when OpenAI headed off in a different direction, he was clearly upset. It's interesting also that Elon Musk backed the California legislation on AI safety that was eventually vetoed by Governor Newsom. So to simply assume that he is going to be anti-regulation, I think, at least based on this history, is not accurate. But of course, it's difficult to tell. Most of the people who know it well, the leading experts in AI technology, are the ones that are calling most loudly for regulation, which, if you're familiar with the tech field, is actually a bit surprising. Silicon Valley, for the most part, has had a libertarian ethos, not a big fan of what happens in Washington, D.C., but at least with regard to AI, a lot of people who know a lot about this technology are coming to Washington and saying to lawmakers, we really do need you to do something. What Biden chose to do was to bring in the tech CEOs of the White House, get some voluntary commitments, the companies agreeing that they would take certain measures to deal with some of the safety issues and the rights issues, knowing that legislation would be difficult to achieve. Now, of course, there were others, including me and my organization, that would have preferred legislation. We don't see voluntary commitments as a sufficient safeguard. And at the same time, we would say that this is a step in the right direction and provides the basis for legislation that could eventually follow. And there is some of this clearly already taking place, where you see, for example, the safety standards that are being established through the safety institutes, reflecting the voluntary commitments that the tech companies had previously agreed to. So this is a form of progress. We're seeing what happens when there's competitive pressure brought to bear on firms where there are large investments, sky-high expectations. It's, I think, not reasonable or rational to imagine that these firms are going to be able to govern themselves. And at the end of the day, this is the reason why governance is ultimately an external function. You need legislation, you need independent oversight. They need to treat the companies in the marketplace fairly and transparently. But the decision of these companies, to fire their safety teams, for example, or to ignore the risks of misinformation is a warning about where we are, but also a reminder about why it is that we actually need legislation as these technologies move forward so quickly. There's a view that says, the Europeans are all about regulation and the U.S. is all about innovation, and you really don't see much regulation in the U.S. But I think if you actually look more closely, there's a very different story that's emerging. Because, of course, it's not only in Washington where you have lawmakers co-sponsoring bills on a wide range of AI topics. You go down to the state level and you see Colorado passes a comprehensive AI law. California, I think, enacted more than a dozen AI laws in the past session. Texas is looking at an AI law that remarkably looks very much like the AI law of the European Union. And if that seems surprising to you, actually it shouldn't be. Because if we take a step back for a moment, we try to answer the question, well, we have a new technology. It obviously offers, some great promise. How are we going to put in place, the guardrails so that the risks are minimized and the benefits are maximized, and we can measure where we're making progress and identifying where we're running into problems? The guardrails look pretty much the same, right? For the roads in Texas and the roads in the European Union, because the goal is basically the same. And I'm anticipating that over time, we'll likely see increasing convergence in these regulatory approaches, because the problems that are being faced are very similar. It really doesn't matter where in the world you are. We've seen this in the data protection realm. Privacy laws around the world all have similar attributes. But at the same time, you also see innovative regulatory responses as new challenges emerge. The European AI Act was moving toward the finish line when suddenly foundational models were dropped into the mix. And so the writers of that legislation had to make some pretty significant changes so that by the time the law was adopted, it fairly reflected the state of technology at the time. So this discussion about new technology and regulation is actually more complex than most people are aware. And one of the reasons it's more complex, almost paradoxical, is that the United States is well known for one of the most sweeping regulations in the technology world, which was Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And what that regulation, technically law, essentially did was to provide a very broad immunity to any internet-based publisher that was making available the content of others. We call these companies today platforms. And Section 230 said to these platforms, whatever is being published, it could be child pornography, it could be defamatory, it could be whatever your category is of things you'd like not to see online, you will not be legally responsible. Whoever initiated the publication will be legally responsible. Well, the problem with Section 230 as a practical matter is that it did push the liability to the endpoints. Meanwhile, the companies in the middle that were offering links to books and to news stories and new forms of media were able to capture the revenue generated by the traffic of internet visitors going to their websites, which became very profitable for a small number of firms. I mean, these are the big companies we talk about today, notably Google and Facebook, that captured that advertising revenue that had gone in the past to news organizations, in part because 230 had immunized them from the consequences that the publishers still faced. I don't think the U.S. Congress is going to repeat 230 for AI-based services. The issue will come up, for example, again in copyright. I don't think there'll be a 230 to protect these companies today because of this prior experience. In the spring of 2023, our center, the Center for AI and Digital Policy, filed a detailed complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, which is a consumer protection agency in Washington. And we asked the FTC to open an investigation of the OpenAI product, ChatGPT. This is a product that can be used to defeat cybersecurity mechanisms, to promote misinformation, to undermine democracy, to threaten children's safety. All of those terms and conclusions, by the way, are taken from the company's own documents. And we were actually happy to read over the summer of 2023, both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal reported that the FTC had opened the investigation. But here we are a year later, and the FTC has still not acted. They've issued some very good business guidance on AI services, which we favor, but they haven't acted on our original complaint. And we recently prepared a report for the U.S. Congress titled No Time for Delay, OpenAI, Guardrails, and the FTC. And our point is simply this: the longer the FTC waits to establish the necessary safeguards, the more difficult we anticipate the task is going to be. Well, at the moment, one of the great opportunities for AI governance is the adoption of this new treaty, which came out of an extensive negotiation at the Council of Europe. Now, in this domain, the Council's mission is human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And so, not surprisingly, the treaty, which was finalized this year, has the aim of advancing democracy, human rights, and the rule of law for AI around the world. Once again, the United States led this effort. It was supported by the member states of the European Union and many other states. We're optimistic about this AI treaty. We spent quite a bit of time working on it. We think it will be very beneficial for the United States and its allies to have a common agreement, a baseline to protect these basic values. We fully anticipate that countries will do additional legislation. It's not the final step in the process of AI governance, but it is a very important foundation. And it's actually very important that it happen sooner rather than later. So we have launched, through the Center for AI and Digital Policy, a global campaign in support of the Council of Europe AI Treaty. And we are urging countries all around the world to support this bold initiative. We think this is an idea that is critical to the human management of AI. And I'll put this very directly. I mean, the phrase AI governance is actually ambiguous. And I think we need to make a decision. Are we going to govern AI, or are we going to be governed by AI? And if we want to govern AI, that means that we need to take the necessary steps to put in place the legal framework that ensures that AI remains human-centric and under our control. My advice to business leaders in this moment is to make sure that you stay on top of these systems, you understand these systems, and you can manage these systems. Now, that may not sound particularly insightful, but here is the challenge with AI. You see, increasingly the systems are black boxes, opaque, aren't easily understood, even by the designers and the engineers, but the outcomes are very impressive. And there's a seductive process that's underway when we see these outputs, whether it happens to be, very good marketing text or increase in ad revenue, and we don't fully understand it and we don't ask too many questions. That is not a good place for a leader to be. You need to understand what is producing results, and you need to anticipate what could be great failures in systems. I'm very much concerned these days about the increasing use of AI systems in the physical world, the management of devices, autonomous vehicles, autonomous weapons. And if you follow what the AI experts are telling us about this moment, first they say it's dangerous. And secondly, they say once we cross this line, we may not be able to go back. I don't see companies solving that problem on their own, particularly in competitive markets where the interest is necessarily going to be to push forward. And that's why we do need effective AI governance.